Susan Boyle was never supposed to become one of the most famous voices in modern music. For most of her life, people expected the opposite. They looked at her quiet personality, her simple lifestyle, and the strange labels doctors had placed on her as a child, and they assumed she would live an ordinary life far away from fame. Yet the story of Susan Boyle has always been about proving people wrong. Now, years after a stroke nearly destroyed her ability to sing, her name is once again appearing in headlines around the world. Fans are asking the same question again: can she really come back? Before we continue, take 1 second to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss more real stories like this. For 6 years, Susan Boyle stayed away from live performances. After suffering a stroke in 2022, many believed her career had reached its final chapter. Doctors warned her that the damage could be permanent. The muscles on one side of her face stopped working properly. Her speech became difficult. Even worse, her voice, the very thing that had carried her from a small Scottish town to global fame, became weak and unstable. Singing, something she had done naturally for decades, suddenly felt impossible. But Susan Boyle has never been someone who gives up easily. To understand why her possible return in 2026 is so emotional for millions of people, you have to go back to the beginning. Long before television audiences stood and cheered for her voice, Susan was just a young girl growing up in a modest house in Blackburn, West Lothian, Scotland. She was born on April 1, 1961, the youngest of 9 children in a large Catholic family. Her mother, Bridget, was already 47 when she became pregnant with Susan, and doctors warned that the pregnancy could be dangerous. They advised her to terminate it because the risks were too high, but Bridget refused. Her faith was strong, and she believed the child deserved a chance to live. The birth turned out to be extremely difficult. Complications forced doctors to perform emergency surgery, and during those frightening moments, Susan was deprived of oxygen for a short period. She was tiny and struggled to breathe after birth. For a while, she had to stay inside an incubator while her parents waited anxiously to see if she would survive. Not long after that, doctors made a diagnosis that would follow her for decades. They told her parents she had brain damage. Today, medical specialists believe that diagnosis was incorrect, but in the 1960s, there were limited tools to question such conclusions, and once the label existed, it stayed with her. Throughout her childhood, teachers treated her differently. Some classmates mocked her. She was often called Susie Simple, a nickname that cut deeply into her confidence. School was a painful experience. Children laughed at her when she struggled with certain lessons. Some pushed her aside socially. Even teachers sometimes assumed she would never achieve much. Over time, the bullying created anxiety and loneliness that stayed with her well into adulthood. Yet inside that shy girl, there was something powerful waiting to be discovered. Music filled her family home. Her father, Patrick, worked as a coal miner but loved performing songs at a local pub in the community. Susan listened carefully whenever he sang. Those moments became a source of comfort for her. While the outside world often made her feel small, music gave her a place where she felt strong. When she was around 12 years old, she began singing at school and in her church choir. Teachers immediately noticed something special in her voice. It was rich, emotional, and far more mature than her age suggested. For the first time in her life, people were praising her rather than doubting her. Church performances became her safe place. As she grew older, she continued working on her voice. In the 1990s, she trained with a vocal coach named Fred O'Neill in Livingston, Scotland. For nearly 6 years, he taught her breathing techniques, vocal control, and how to develop the powerful mezzo-soprano tone that would later shock the world. Those training sessions built discipline and confidence, even though success still seemed far away. Her personal life, however, was not easy. Susan spent many years caring for her aging mother, Bridget, who suffered from illness. They were extremely close, and Susan often said that her mother was the only person who truly believed she could become a professional singer. When Bridget passed away in 2007 at the age of 91, Susan felt completely lost. For months, she barely sang at all. The dream that had kept her going for decades suddenly felt pointless. But eventually, she remembered something her mother had always told her: never give up on your talent. That advice pushed Susan to take one more chance. 2 years later, in 2009, she applied for a television talent show that was holding auditions in Glasgow. The program was already popular, but no one expected the moment that was about to happen. Susan Boyle was 48 years old when she walked onto that stage. She wore a simple beige coat and looked nothing like a typical pop star. As she introduced herself to the judges, some members of the audience laughed quietly. When she said she hoped to become as successful as musical theater star Elaine Paige, the reaction in the room was skeptical. Even the judges seemed doubtful. But then the music began. Susan started singing "I Dreamed a Dream" from the musical Les Miserables. Within seconds, the entire atmosphere changed. The laughter stopped. The judges looked up in shock. Her voice filled the theater with power and emotion, carrying decades of rejection and hope in every note. By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet. That audition quickly became one of the most famous television moments in history. Millions of people watched it online within days. The video spread across the world, and suddenly the quiet woman from Blackburn was everywhere: news programs, talk shows, and international interviews. In less than 48 hours, Susan Boyle had gone from an unknown church volunteer to a global sensation. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, was released later that year and immediately broke records. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies in its first week and eventually reached millions worldwide. She became one of the best-selling new artists of the decade. For someone who had spent most of her life being told she would never achieve anything special, the transformation was almost unbelievable. But fame also brought pressure. Tabloids followed her everywhere. Cameras waited outside her small house. Reporters questioned every detail of her life. The sudden attention became overwhelming, and after the final episode of the talent show, she was briefly admitted to a clinic for exhaustion and anxiety. Still, she continued moving forward. Over the next decade, Susan Boyle released multiple albums, performed across the world, and sold tens of millions of records. The woman who had once been bullied at school had become one of the most successful singers to ever come out of a television talent show. Yet life had another challenge waiting for her, one that would test her strength more than anything she had faced before. And it arrived suddenly in 2022.
The year 2022 changed everything for Susan Boyle. For more than a decade after her stunning rise to fame, she had built a remarkable career. Albums continued to sell, concerts filled with devoted fans, and her story remained one of the most inspiring journeys in modern entertainment. But on a quiet night in April 2022, something happened that threatened to take all of that away. It began without warning. On the evening of April 30th, Susan felt perfectly normal. There were no signs that anything was wrong. She went to sleep expecting the next day to be just another ordinary morning. But when she woke up, her world had completely changed. Her manager soon noticed that something was terribly wrong. One side of Susan's face appeared to be drooping. Her speech sounded slurred and broken. Even worse, the left side of her body had become weak and difficult to move. She had suffered a stroke. Doctors rushed to treat her as quickly as possible, but the damage had already affected muscles connected to her speech and facial movement. For most people, this would be frightening enough, but for a singer whose entire life revolved around her voice, the fear was almost unbearable. Susan could barely speak clearly. Singing felt impossible. The same voice that had once stunned millions of people on television suddenly seemed like it might disappear forever. At 60 years old, she found herself lying in a hospital bed, wondering if the career she had fought so hard to build was over. Doctors were honest about the situation. They explained that strokes affecting facial muscles and speech often cause permanent damage. Recovery could take years, and sometimes full recovery never happens at all. For someone whose identity was deeply connected to music, the thought was devastating. Susan later described those early days as one of the darkest periods of her life. The woman who had once filled concert halls with powerful notes could barely pronounce simple words. Even introducing herself felt difficult. But something inside her refused to accept defeat. She had spent her entire life fighting against people's expectations. As a child, she had been told she had brain damage. At school, she had been bullied and mocked. Before fame arrived, she had faced rejection after rejection while trying to pursue music. Every time the world told her she could not succeed, she had eventually proven it wrong. So she made a decision. If the stroke had taken something from her, she would fight to take it back. Soon after leaving the hospital, Susan began an intense recovery program. She hired a private speech therapist and started attending sessions multiple times every week. The exercises were slow and frustrating at first. She practiced simple sounds again and again, trying to retrain muscles that once moved naturally. At home, the work continued. Standing in front of a mirror, she repeated words and vowel sounds for hours. She carefully watched the movement of her face, trying to restore balance between both sides. Sometimes the practice sessions lasted up to 5 hours a day. It was exhausting. But slowly, tiny improvements started appearing. The muscles around her mouth began responding again. Her speech gradually became clearer. Encouraged by that progress, she added vocal training to the routine. Vocal coaches helped her rebuild breath control and tone, starting with the most basic scales. At first, the notes sounded weak and shaky, but they were there, and that was enough to keep her going. Month after month, the routine continued. Physical therapy strengthened the left side of her body. Speech therapy improved her pronunciation. Vocal exercises slowly rebuilt the power in her voice. By early 2023, something incredible happened. One afternoon, while practicing alone, Susan quietly began singing the same song that had changed her life years earlier, "I Dreamed a Dream." It was the first time since the stroke that she had attempted it fully. When the final note came out clearly, she reportedly burst into tears. It was the moment she realized her voice was truly returning. The entire recovery journey cost more than £50,000, all paid from her own savings. But for Susan, the money did not matter. What mattered was proving that the stroke had not taken away the one thing she loved most. Then came a moment that shocked fans around the world. On June 3, 2023, exactly 14 years after her famous audition, Susan Boyle stepped back onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent during the show's finale. She joined the cast of Les Miserables and once again sang "I Dreamed a Dream." Millions of viewers watched the performance. The audience quickly realized that something extraordinary was happening. Susan's voice carried the same emotion and strength that had amazed the world back in 2009. Near the end of the performance, she revealed something that many people did not know. She told the audience she had suffered a major stroke the year before. The crowd immediately rose to its feet. Judges and performers surrounded her on stage as applause filled the theater. For many viewers, the moment felt bigger than music. It was proof of resilience, determination, and the power of refusing to give up. After that appearance, Susan slowly began planning her next chapter. In 2025, she shared photos from a recording studio in London, confirming that she was working on new music again. For the first time in years, she stood in front of a microphone preparing fresh material for fans. The excitement quickly returned. Supporters who had followed her journey since the famous audition began sharing messages online, celebrating her comeback. Many said their story gave them hope during difficult moments in their own lives. Then, in early 2026, another announcement brought her name back into headlines. Simon Cowell revealed that the upcoming anniversary season of Britain's Got Talent would celebrate the most unforgettable performers in the show's history, and he made it clear that Susan Boyle was one of the most important. He openly said he wanted her to return. Fans immediately began wondering whether she might perform again on the stage that made her famous. The idea of seeing Susan Boyle stand there once more after surviving a stroke created enormous excitement across social media. But television was not the only plan. Susan also announced that she would perform at the Summer's End Angus Festival in August 2026, marking her first major festival appearance in years. The event is expected to attract thousands of fans who want to witness her long-awaited live return. For many people, this moment feels like the beginning of a new chapter rather than simply a comeback, because Susan Boyle's life has never followed the path anyone predicted. She went from a bullied schoolgirl to a global star, from an unknown church singer to a record-breaking artist, and now, after facing one of the most frightening health battles of her life, she is once again preparing to stand in front of audiences and sing. Her story has always been about resilience, and perhaps that is why her voice continues to touch so many people around the world. Because every time Susan Boyle sings, it carries something deeper than music. It carries the sound of someone who refused to stop believing.